Dr. Jones's research interests focus upon the history of the British Army, with a particular emphasis on the Anglo-Boer War and the First World War. His work in this field is wide-ranging, covering command, leadership, morale, recruitment, tactics and training. In this Cove Talk, Dr. Jones will discuss examples in military history that have caused armies to improvise and adapt. The presentation aims to help us consider how we can encourage preemptive adaptation and innovation without the external forces of defeat and loss. Dr. Jones, it's great to have you here today, live from the UK. And I now invite you to address the audience.
Oh, hello there. I can only say a very, very good morning to you all, or perhaps more accurately, I should say a very, very good afternoon to you all. It's considerably later in the day at your end than it is at mine, but it's a real pleasure to actually be invited to deliver this Cove Talk today. And over the next 25 minutes or so, I hope to offer you some real food for thought on the topic of military history and how it can be used to encourage preemptive adaptation. And I think to start this concept, we need to think a little bit about the word adaptation. We take this word from the natural sciences. In nature, as we know, organisms are constantly exposed to challenges and stimuli which provoke adaptation. Quite often these stimuli come in the form of a threat. The rise of a new predator, a competitor for the same food source, an environmental change. And we also know from natural sciences that organisms that fail to adapt in a timely manner suffer fatal consequences. Quite often the extinction of the species follows, whereas those who do adapt successfully go on to remain in the natural cycle. It's easy to see the parallels from the natural world to the military world. Armies that adapt quickly, efficiently and effectively, particularly in wartime, generally emerge victorious. But of course, armies that are slow to adapt or identify the wrong lessons or do not implement them in a timely fashion are often defeated. And the consequences of a military defeat can be just as severe as the consequences of a failure to adapt in the natural world, at its worst, leading to the extinction of national independence for the defeated party. But whereas in the natural world, the simple act of living day to day in the wild will ultimately provoke a whole series of changes. It will confront an organism with a wide variety of challenges and stimuli. In military terms, these stimuli are at their greatest during times of war. But as the topic of this and the description of this talk states, how can we stimulate and indeed cause armies to adapt without the pressure of loss and defeat? It's something of a truism for particularly the British Army that it adapts most readily when it's under the most severe pressure, and that's usually in terms of military defeat. Of course, Britain as a nation has always had something of a fallback position in the existence of the English Channel, which has prevented enemy armies from landing on British shores for over 1,000, or almost 1,000 years, I should say. But relying upon the stimulus of military defeat is not an ideal way to promote adaptation. History is replete with examples of armies that have been too slow to adapt once the defeats have started coming in and have suffered cataclysmic and ultimately war-ending defeats in the process. But of course, armies aren't constantly at war. There's long periods of peace between major engagements, and indeed this is to be admired and appreciated. But how can adaptation be maintained even in periods of peace when there are not the number of direct stimuli, there's not the same number of challenges? Indeed, during a long period of peace, the opposite of adaptation can begin to take hold, atrophy, a period and indeed a process where there are no changes, or at least the changes are so minor as to have very little effect. How can armies avoid this in times of peace? Well, the answer is a complex one, but I think, and I'm going to make the case in the next 20 minutes or so, that study of military history can really help to combat the effects of atrophy. There's two reasons why this is the case. First of all, military history is absolutely replete with examples of armies that have atrophied during peacetime and then have paid the ultimate price during war. Whether it is the example of ancient Sparta, on the eve of the Peloponnesian War against the city-state of Athens, Sparta had rested on its laurels ever since the defeat of the Persians some decades earlier. Its army had not developed, had not adapted. It suffered severe defeats at the beginning of the war, and it took quite literally years for the Spartans to recover their position in the Greek peninsula. In more recent terms, we see the army of Frederick the Great, extremely successful in the mid-18th century, but again resting on its laurels in the decades that followed until eventually it was swept away cataclysmically by Napoleon's French army in 1806. And even closer to home, or certainly more close to our time period, The fate of the French army in 1940 provides a shocking lesson on the dangers of complacency and atrophy during a period of peace. Of course, the French army, which had held the line so magnificently in the First World War, was swept away in a little over 6 weeks in 1940, and French national independence was extinguished. If these warnings themselves are not enough, I think we can also look through military history at examples of armies that have adapted successfully. I'll be moving on to that point in a little moment, but just to emphasize the value of military history in times of peace, I would make the point that's sometimes neglected, that military history must be one of the oldest forms in the academy that we have records of. We know that the ancient Egyptians recorded accounts of their military campaigns, as too did the ancient Greeks. We know that the Romans studied Greek accounts of warfare, and so long did the Roman Empire endure that the later soldiers of the Roman Empire would study the campaigns of their earlier forebears, who were in some cases fighting centuries earlier. Roman writing influenced European monarchs right up until the Renaissance, and for a more perhaps relevant example to us today, many of us still turn to the writings of a Napoleonic era scholar, Karl von Clausewitz, and try and apply his thoughts to the problems that we face today. There's therefore an enormous mosaic of military history for us to draw upon, and not merely for the examples of atrophy, which I mentioned earlier, but also for examples of successful adaptation and the consequences that that would have. Now, while I don't expect any of you in the audience to have these views, and if you do, please leave immediately, but you may have come across at various points in your career those who oppose the use of military history in this fashion. And quite often they will cite to you examples such as the fact that the modern battle space is radically different to any previous war, that the pace of technology has increased so swiftly that previous lessons are rendered invalid, and even that the society from which armies are now being drawn has changed so much that we can't draw lessons of personnel and leadership anymore. There's a certain element of truth in some of these arguments, and they can sometimes be difficult to refute. But the era I would urge you to consider if you are refuting these arguments is just to think about the British Army, and by extension, of course, Anzac forces and later the Australian Army, in the period 1899 to 1945. A 46-year period, not an enormous amount of time in the grand scheme of human history. But in that time, the British Army fought 3 major wars: the Anglo-Boer War, the First World War, and the Second World War, and it underwent an almost constant process of adaptation, by necessity, one might add. Consider, for example, the changes of technology in this period. In 1899, when Britain went to war in South Africa, there was no powered flight, there was no wireless, petrol transport was a novelty, and the horse was still the prime mover. 46 years later, at the end of the Second World War, we have jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, portable radios, mechanized warfare, and of course, the introduction of the atomic bomb. So when we think about the pace of technological change and the changing battle space, we are not the first armies to have gone through a similar process. Our forebearers went through a radical process. It is comparable in many ways to our own just over a century ago. And this is where we can see the sheer scope of military history and understand that it is so replete with examples that there's always something that will be of interest and relevance to a current problem. A word of warning on this, of course, and that's that military history is not a crystal ball for the future. Every war is unique. What has happened in the past is the past. It cannot completely accurately predict what will happen in the future. But what it can do is provide a set of signposts for likely outcomes, quite often based on the simple fact of human nature has not changed radically, certainly for 1,000 or so years. And when we look at military problems, we will see many of our own problems echoing and repeating in the past, of course framed within the context of that era and the problems of that era, but it can provide us a useful rough guide for the likely outcomes for a variety of problems and the solutions they have. How can this be used, though, to promote adaptation in the current era? Well, by studying how armies adapt successfully or indeed unsuccessfully, either approach to this will be equally rewarding. It can give you the intellectual energy and give you the ideas about how these might be applied to your own problems. When we look back at war as well, I would urge you, if you're considering adaptation, and how it might be implemented in your own forces, I'd urge you to think not just about the very large scales of war, but also think about some of the smaller incidents in war. And the example I'd like to cite just in this talk is actually from the Anglo-Boer War, 1899 to 1902. That's a war that's so old it might not seem to have great particular relevance. But there's elements of that war that you can see very, very clear and striking adaptation, which may well have certain resonances with the present day. For example, the Boer War began in October 1899 with a conventional phase. And at the beginning of that conventional phase, Boer forces, who were essentially irregular militiamen, albeit unusually tough and unusually resourceful, Boer irregular forces formed into conventionally shaped armies, actually invaded British South Africa to lay siege to border towns. A British Expeditionary Force arrived with the intention of relieving those towns. But of course, the army arrived in South Africa ridden with complacency. And in some ways, that complacency was well placed. The British army had fought a staggering amount of colonial wars in the 19th century. The Boer War in 1899 was the 226th war fought during the reign of Queen Victoria, which gives you some impression of the amount of time the army spent on campaign. And the British Army of that era had been remarkably successful in the wars it had fought. Indeed, one of the reasons we remember British defeats in this period, like Isandlwana at the hands of the Zulus, is because they were simply so rare that they actually left an indelible impression on the British psyche. So the army had reasons for confidence for going to war in South Africa, but it also had reasons to fear its opponents, not least the fact that the British had previously fought a war against the Boers, the first Boer War, in the early 1880s, and had actually been defeated, resulting in a compromise peace deal very soon afterwards. But this was dismissed by the army, and it was particularly dismissed by the army's intelligence services, who believed the Boers were no longer the same quality of man who had defeated the British nearly 20 years earlier. Of course, the lesson, or the danger, I should say, of complacency was starkly revealed. The British Army, for all its talents, was not especially well prepared to campaign in the South African environment or against the Boers themselves, who the Boers, uniquely for British opponents, entirely mounted, armed with the latest small arms, magazine-loading rifles, and also possessing a small amount of modern artillery, were quite unlike any other colonial opponent that the British had faced. The result of this complacency was that the British Army suffered not one, not two, but 3 battlefield defeats in a single week in December 1899, a period known as the Black Week. This created a scandal back in Britain, and it forced the British government to make a very difficult decision. It could either make a political compromise at this point, or it could redouble its efforts to win the war. The Boers certainly hoped a political compromise would follow. It did not. The British redoubled their efforts, sent vast reinforcements, including, of course, Australian soldiers, to South Africa to reinforce the defeated armies and turn the tide of war. Under the leadership, one might add, of the venerable Lord Roberts, VC, who was probably Britain's most prestigious soldier at the time, but also one of Britain's oldest. Age is no barrier to adaptation, however. Roberts, once he arrived in theatre, noted a number of things, and one of these was that the British Army, despite its defeats, was beginning to show low-level tactical adaptation at a battalion level or occasionally at a brigade level. And many of these adaptations were being driven by defeat and loss. For example, the abandonment of officers' swords, which marked them out, made them very easy targets for Boer snipers, even the removal of rank insignia from officers for the same reason. And other tactical changes were becoming evident: a greater use of fire and movement, dispersed formations to avoid being engaged by Boer small arms fire swiftly, better scouting, and better and more intelligent use of cover. And these were all being provoked by the defeats and the setbacks the British Army had suffered up to this point. What Lord Roberts did, which is interesting, is he codified many of these changes in a remarkably short and simple pamphlet, really, a guidebook of less than a dozen pages, fewer than a dozen pages, simply called Notes for Guidance on South African Warfare, in which he effectively codified many of these changes that had already existed, and also introduced some additional changes, or suggestions, one should say, based on his own experiences of campaigning in India. As an example of just a simple publication issued very rapidly, it was published in January 1900, a mere week after he had arrived in South Africa. It's an interesting example of how it doesn't take an enormous amount of paperwork and thinking to quickly adapt in field. And I think there's a lesson there, perhaps, for armies in peacetime, where sometimes Certainly in the case of the British Army, there can be an enormous process of trying to draw up doctrine, of trying to draw up keynotes and so forth, when in fact, simply codifying adaptation that's already happening can be done considerably more quickly. The war turned from January 1900 onwards. Roberts, with his reinforcements, was able to turn the tide against the Boers, carry the fight into Boer territory. And indeed, by August 1900, the Boer capitals of Bloemfontein and Pretoria had both fallen to British forces. Lord Roberts declared the war over, and he departed back to Britain as a hero. He left his subordinate in charge for mopping up operations. This subordinate was Lord Kitchener of Car 2. Lord Kitchener believed he was being left with the duty to simply mop up a handful of Boer forces that were still operating in the country. It's what we perhaps call a phase 4 operation now, and just like phase 4, most notoriously perhaps in Iraq in 2003, proved to be considerably longer and more difficult than anticipated, so too did Lord Kitchener's mopping up operation. It actually went on for almost 2 years. It left very large parts of South Africa devastated, and of course it was marred by the infamous use of concentration camps to house Boer civilians who had been evicted from their homes by British scorched earth tactics. The guerrilla phase, as it's known, would probably now be known as an insurgency phase. Here we see the enemy, in the case of the Boers, choosing to adapt. It's very interesting that the Boers had struggled throughout 1900 to try and stop the British advance. Their armies were repeatedly outflanked, outnumbered, and driven from their positions. But in the latter half of 1900, the remaining Boer forces convened in mountains to the north of the country and actually made a very conscious decision to split themselves into their component units and carry out a guerrilla campaign with the intention of trying to exhaust Britain and force a political compromise. Here we see an enemy adapting in the field in a not dissimilar way to the British had adapted earlier on. I think that's an important lesson of military history. Your enemy will also seek to adapt and may well effectively get inside your learning curve and learn faster and adapt more readily than you, at least if you're not prepared. Certainly the British were not prepared for counterinsurgency. Initial efforts to bring the Boer counterinsurgency to a halt were crude, were clumsy. Very large-scale sweeps were made with brigade strength forces simply marching across South Africa, hoping to bring the Boers into a conventional battle. Or the other option was to send fairly large British forces into areas known where it was known the Boers were operating, in the hope the Boers could be drawn into a conventional battle. But of course, this didn't happen. The Boers were far too mobile. They could avoid these sweeps, and they could strike in the rear areas of the British position, disrupting rail transports, logistic hubs, terrorizing civilians in cases, and of course ambushing individual British patrols. What we see in this period are all the difficulties and horrors of insurgency warfare, and this of course is Britain's first real major experience of an insurgency. It's marred by atrocities on both sides, execution of prisoners, which to an Australian audience you probably most readily know through the story of Breaker Morant, but also destruction of property, in many cases needless civilian casualties, not merely to the Boers but also to British supporting civilians operating in the region, and of course African tribal populations who were rather caught in the crossfire between the two sides. The insurgency ultimately ends in May 1902, and the manner in which it's brought to an end is rather instructive and again shows adaptation. The first great change is a change in force composition for the British, moving away from these very heavy foot-slogging columns towards much more agile, mobile, mounted forces. Relatively small columns, perhaps as little as 50 men up to maybe 250 men maximum, so really the size of a company. And what we see in this force composition is quite interesting. As well as the mounted infantry component, which provides the main fighting power, at the head of the column it was found to be very useful to include interpreters, whether they were local South Africans or British soldiers who happened to have the language skills. Native trackers were found to be very useful, whether they were black African trackers or again South African settlers who were experienced in the terrain, the wildlife, etc. Intelligence officers accompanying the columns were found to be very useful. They could collect intelligence in the field, and then there was a system in place where they would feed back to a central repository, if you will, of information, and in return would receive a weekly intelligence summary, which would give them some impression of the wider war and what was happening in their area. Even smaller changes, such as the inclusion of Royal Military Police, just a handful with each column, with a specific duty of handling prisoners, proved an advantage. This may seem a bit of a simplicity, but of course A prisoner who is executed can't provide any form of intelligence. The presence of the Royal Military Police gave the column an ability to handle prisoners, to discourage fired up soldiers from abusing them, and also ensure that those prisoners were brought back safely and in reasonable health back to a position where they could be interrogated and better information could be gathered. It seems a simple adaptation, but this greatly increased the amount of intelligence the British Army could gather from captured prisoners. And so just from that example, a relatively small example from history, and one that may not have occurred to you perhaps, we tend to focus particularly on the First and Second World Wars as having more relevance for modern warfare. It's possible to see that even a war such as the Boer War has relevance and has clear examples of adaptation both on the British side and again on the Boer side, as both sides interact and react with one another. It also gives some salutary lessons about adaptation. It clearly shows the dangers of complacency. I think there's a strong argument to be made that the British Army had atrophied. Effectively, it was suffering from victory disease in the late 19th century. Its methods seemed to work. It felt no great need to consider what would happen if they didn't. It also, however, shows that underpinning that complacency, there was the ability to adapt. And that ability to adapt is key to the British Army's success throughout that 1899 to 1945 period. In the three major wars it fights, it's forced to adapt fairly readily against formidable foes in all three of those wars. The fact that it emerges victorious from all three is testament to that adaptability. We see infield adaptation in the Boer War, whether it's the changes that are happening from below as a result of defeats, whether it's Lord Roberts codifying changes in January 1900, or whether it's the change, which is largely driven from below as well for force composition in the guerrilla phase. We see changes here. I'd also add for the guerrilla phase that by the end of the sort of mid to late 1901, so the guerrilla war's been going on for a year, there's a much wider change in policy in South Africa generally, a move away from trying to pin the Boers down and destroy them in battle with search and destroy operations, and a move towards securing urban centres such as they are in South Africa, restoring normalcy to this area, then spreading that zone of control outwards to outlying villages, again restoring normalcy and securing the area with actually a fortified line, the so-called blockhouse line. It certainly bears a resemblance to the so-called ink spot theory of dealing with insurgencies, but this is driven from above, just as the adaptation from below for force composition is coming, and those two meet in the middle and make an effective counterinsurgency force. And so we see adaptation in the field in very difficult circumstances, and in many ways unique circumstances. It's Britain's first large-scale insurgency it's ever faced, and yet it emerges from it victorious, with reputation somewhat damaged because of particularly the use of scorched earth and concentration camps. But nevertheless, the military adaptations are ultimately the key to overcoming the Boer insurgency. That's just one example from that whole period, 1899 to 1945. If time permitted, we could spend many hours discussing this period. And this is where I think preemptive military history is useful to preemptive adaptation. I think there's two barriers to using military history in this regard. The first is the sheer scope of military history. Where does one start? Do you start by looking at the campaigns of the Sea Peoples against the Egyptians around about 1200 BC? There may be something there. I can't necessarily recommend it, or do you start with something very recent, such as Afghanistan in the 21st century? That the scope of military history can sometimes seem bewildering, and actually where to start in this study can be overwhelming. If you're in doubt, if you're struggling for a place to start, I would strongly recommend looking at British or indeed Australian involvement in 1899 to 1945, both in war and in peace, because of course you see the armies altering in the aftermath of the Boer War, and then altering again in the aftermath of the First World War. It's an era replete with lessons, and if you are struggling for a starting point, I would strongly recommend this as your first port of call. The second point about how military history can inform adaptation is, how do you actually use this? It's all well and good to study the campaigns of great commanders or read accounts of wars. These will certainly help. These will promote your thinking. They'll give you examples to dwell upon and think about. But I think there's a danger, and I've certainly seen this with elements of the British Army, when studying history, to focus on the very, very big picture. And there's certainly a place for that. But do not neglect the smaller matters as well. To go back to that Boer War example I just gave, it could be very interesting to war game, for example, an early part of the Boer War, the conventional phase of the Boer War. Certainly things could be learned from that. But don't neglect the smaller instance, the smaller actions. What happens when you have small mobile columns operating in enemy territory? How do you bring home Boer prisoners in the face of a very angry unit? How does the Royal Military Police manage to do this? How do intelligence officers action intelligence? Lots and lots of smaller points can be just as valuable as looking at the much bigger picture of generals, battles, and grand campaigns. And if you're looking for inspiration to use military history to provoke this type of thinking, picking out small incidents, looking at how units or indeed individuals adapted to their changed circumstances and with what effect can sometimes just provide a spark of inspiration for the problems that you may be facing yourself. Again, a caveat to this, of course, it's not a crystal ball. As wonderful as it would be if it was, that's simply not the case, but it can provoke a spark of imagination and it can give us that idea about thinking about adaptation in two senses. One, all the examples of what happens if armies do not have cultures of adaptation are there for us to see. Defeat and indeed potentially national extinction. And equally, examples of armies that do adapt, and I would count both the British and the Australian forces in the 20th century very highly in this regard, give us an example to follow, a spirit to follow. And not merely, I'm not saying that these armies are, of course, invincible or perfect, but by and large, when the crisis is on, they get the key decisions right. What is it that allows these armies to get the key decisions right? What can we learn from their experiences that we can then use to inform our own military developments in the 21st century? I hope at the very least this just over 25-minute presentation has given you some food for thought, some inspiration, and I'll be very, very happy to take any questions that you may have now. Thank you very much.
Okay, so some questions. The first question is from Greg Colton at Headquarters Forces Command in Sydney. He says, during the interwar years, von Seeckt appointed an Inspector General for the Reichswehr who reported directly to him. The Inspector General gave recommendations for adaptation based on observations of military manoeuvres. Assessment of field commanders was not based on how well they commanded their soldiers in the field, but on whether they had successfully incorporated the lessons identified the previous year. Would this model of enforced preemptive adaptation have merit today?
I think that's a very interesting question. I'm often asked about von Seeckt and his approach towards this. I think one thing we must be a little bit wary of when we're talking about von Seeckt's approach is he was operating in a fairly unique political circumstance, an era when the German army was effectively abolished and was in some ways mustering in secret. And then later, of course, with the rise of Adolf Hitler, suddenly receives a huge dose of finance and inspiration and indeed intellectual energy. I think as a model, it certainly has its merits, but we must remember that this is a German army that is training for a very, very specific duty, which is effectively to reclaim lost territory from lost during the First World War and the Treaty of Versailles. And it's easier for the German army in this period to identify lessons because it only really has one or possibly two wars to be thinking about, either a war with Poland in the east or a war with France in the west. By comparison, the British army also has an Inspector General system, both between the Boer and the First World War, and then again the First and Second World War. And the British Army, because it has a wider range of potential opponents it could fight, potential theatres it could engage in, it does not have a similar system. It would not emphasise those type of lessons. I think for learning very specific lessons that the Army wishes to inculcate, assessing the offering Inspector General reports, assessing whether those lessons have been learned, does have some merit. But again, I would caution that that method, as seductive as it often looks, is very much based on a particular set of political circumstances. It would be harder for an army that demanded global or at least multi-theatre capability to have that in place. What might serve for operations, say, just from a British perspective, operations in Africa would not serve, for example, for operations in the Middle East.
So the next question comes from Solomon Birch at the Army School of Transport. He asks, were Breaker-Morant and the Bushveld Carbineers the adaptive heroes the British Empire needed, or just the ones it wanted at the time?
Well, that's an excellent question. The simple answer is, I think with the Bushveld Carbineers, and they're not the only unit which gets involved in this kind of unpleasantness, I might add. They're the type of unit the British Empire thinks it needs, but then doesn't like when it finds. Break-Morant and the Carbineers are very much caught as a scapegoat. The use of the shooting of Boer prisoners is widespread by this stage. Douglas Haig, who goes on to command the British Army in the British Expeditionary Force, I should say, in the First World War, is absolutely open in his diary in the Boer War that about shooting Boer prisoners. And this is a man who, of course, rises to Field Marshal later in his career. And I think there's actually a lesson there about the type of hard-fighting unit that armies think they want, but then don't like when they have. And we see this a lot in the Boer War. At the early stage of the guerrilla war, there's a lot of criticism that the rules of engagement are confusing, that the units themselves, who are all volunteer, I might add, are reluctant to press on and reluctant to really get stuck into the Boers, and that there needs to be more aggression. And this is inculcated through sackings of officers, and a whole host of systems go on. But of course, then you start to produce units that are hard fighting, but that comes with a number of complexities as well. And it's not merely violence towards Boer prisoners, it's violence towards Boer civilians, and it's indeed violence in garrison towns. I mentioned the Royal Military Police earlier. The arrest figures for British soldiers in garrison towns in South Africa in the Boer War was quite shocking, and much of it is due to brawling and drinking and carousing and so on. But it's not necessarily what you want, and I think that's an interesting point to make about the British Army is very happy to have the Carbineers carrying out really quite severe acts of violence against the Boers, along with other units. But eventually, it goes too far, and at that point, they no longer are the type of thing the British Empire wants. The point I just make about scapegoats, I do think that they were unlucky in the sense that they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's not to excuse what they were doing, but the argument that was indeed put forward in the trial that, well, everyone else is doing it, certainly has some merit. But I think there's actually a lesson there about what type of fighting unit do we actually want, and what do we do when it becomes something that we didn't quite expect.
The next question comes from David from the School of Infantry. He says, the British experience of 100 years ago appears to suggest that more soldiers with more diverse functions, like intelligence and military police, allows the force to be successful in a complex war. However, recent trends suggest contemporary armies are seeking more from a less functionally diverse force. For example, teaching infantry soldiers to handle prisoners and operate small drones, perhaps due to higher levels of education. Do you think fewer, better trained and educated soldiers will also be able to achieve success in modern complex wars?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and at risk of turning it back into looking at the Boer War and just after, this was, it may surprise you to know, a debate that was actually being had just after the Boer War. Educational levels even then were rising, and particularly the level of volunteerism in the Boer War had put a lot of people into the army who wouldn't necessarily have been recruited in peacetime. And there was a school of thought, even in 1902, that there was less need for specialization, and that the dream of certain figures in the British Army at the time was to create what they termed the self-sufficient infantryman. And this was a multi-skilled infantryman who could, he could fight, shoot, march, engage in battle, but he could also carry out his own intelligence work. He was, a skilled engineer and have a range of skills. It's an ideal that was never quite achieved. Inevitably, there's value in specialization, and the British Army's educational levels at that time, although they were improving, were of course not up to the standard today. One thing I will say on that point is I think in peace, training infantry to have multiple specializations and a wide range of skills has undoubted benefits. We can see this in the 1902-14 period when the army is trained with this idea of self-sufficient infantry in mind. And we can also see it in the famous and much lauded German system of the First and Second World Wars, to try and train soldiers, or an NCO, train soldiers to do the duty of an NCO, NCOs to do the duty of the rank above them, etc., so that people can fill in. But I do think that there's a danger in the idea that one can simply make self-sufficient soldiers. It's extremely time-consuming, and in all volunteer armies, of course, where there's natural wastage, it's difficult to perhaps maintain people with this large number of skills unless they're truly dedicated. Also, one of the lessons of the First World War is that and indeed the Second World War, is that specialization is useful as technology increases. We can all handle a certain amount of technology, but can we repair it? Can we operate it under conditions of great duress? And above all else, can you find people who can do this in an efficient way and find room to replace casualties? The idea of therefore training infantry up to have a wider range of skills rather than relying on specialists has a lot of merit, and I think it's one that's worth exploring and indeed following. But all attempts in history to remove specialization, not reduce, I should add, but to remove specialization, have ultimately come unstuck during war, where specialization becomes very important. And again, a little example of that from the First World War. I mentioned this idea of self-sufficient infantrymen. One of the problems in the First World War, particularly in the middle years of the war, was that highly trained infantrymen were being constantly asked to do labor duties. Not a great way to spend your use your highly trained personnel, but there'll always be a role, for example, for lower skilled work as well. So finding the balance between having specialists who are expert in their field and also having highly trained, the self-sufficient infantrymen, is something that's eluded the British Army. Whether it can be achieved in the 21st century with the highest education levels we've ever seen remains to be seen.
The next question comes from the CEO of 5 Aviation Regiment. He asks, are there any lessons in terms of understanding political and social contexts that have driven positive military adaptation during peacetime?
Well, that's a really good question. I was sort of hoping somebody would ask me about this, because although I've talked about the Boer War, I think if we look at the period that follows the Boer War for the British Army, we'll call it the Edwardian period, 1902 to 1914, is a rare example, one might say, from the British perspective, of particularly political trends and political involvement driving the adaptation of the army. The army emerges from the Boer War with a real spirit of reform, a real determination to reform itself. This leads to an outpouring of intellectual energy. It's something of a golden age for intellectual energy in the British Army of this period. That's not to say it's not without its flaws. It's still the army of its day. Excuse me. But it has two advantages that previous generations of that army did not have. First of all, after a period of some uncertainty with a variety of Secretary of States for War, Richard Haldane, later Lord Haldane, becomes Secretary of State for War in 1906, widely considered to be one of the greatest Secretary of States for War in British political history. And although he has no military background, he's a lawyer by background, he has a almost intuitive understanding of military matters and a passionate desire to see the British Army genuinely become better. And perhaps because he has no military background, and also I think because of his own natural intelligence and inclinations, he is able to forge a bond between the political body and also the military body that has been often eluded British or indeed Western armies in general. And what we see in this period is he greatly encourages the improvement and the adaptation of the British Army. Initiatives are encouraged within reason, because the government is still committed to keeping costs as low as possible. And we see that rarest of things, which is an army that's operating under a slowly, in real terms, a reducing budget, actually improves its efficiency and its military effectiveness. And Haldane's drive towards this is a major part. He's also the creator of the reserve system, the territorial army of its day, now known as the Army Reserve, which is formalizes Britain's second line forces, and a system that we broadly still have to this day. He's also able to benefit from social change that's going on. One of the things that the Boer War revealed was, perhaps to the surprise of politicians, that there was actually a degree of enthusiasm for the army. There was a phrase in the Edwardian era which was analogous to "it's the devil or the deep blue sea" or "a rock and a hard place," which was "it's the army or the workhouse." Joining the army was considered a last resort if you couldn't find a job anywhere else. But in the Boer War, there had been this huge surge of volunteerism. And what had happened was, for the first time really in British Victorian history, very educated individuals and people from quite diverse backgrounds had entered the army, they'd served in it, and by and large they returned from their experiences and were positive about it. And so there was a social mood. The social mood changed towards the army. Again, we can overemphasize this. The army still predominantly recruited from the very lowest classes, but the mood towards the army improved, and a great deal of public interest followed. And I think that combination of both very idealized political leadership from Haldane above, combined with a social mood which was becoming increasingly pro-army, and regarding it in a much more favourable light, as we can see from reports of army manoeuvres, interest in army pageantry and so forth. We have those two mixing. I always think there's a little lesson there, and it's one that I come across just in working with the British Army. I think there can sometimes be an assumption in armies that the public doesn't like them, or a comparison to a mythical golden age when the public opinion towards the military was at its highest. Again, one of the features certainly in British history is when this frequently happens, there's a feeling, oh, well, the public have lost interest in the army, and yet during times of crisis and during times of danger, that mood very, very quickly reverses. I think we can look through 20th century British military history, and I would dare say Australian military history too, and find examples where the army it falls from favour, but in times of real crisis, it usually is restored. So there is usually that social underpinning as well. Now, finding a politician of the vision of Lord Haldane is a rather different matter, but I'm afraid I can't solve that one.
The next question comes from Tom Burke at the School of Infantry. Are you able to give an example of where preemptive adaptation has led to failure? How can we avoid repeating this failure?
That's a really interesting question, because it does happen. Perhaps the most obvious and frightening example is the French army in the 1930s. We could give others, but the French army stands out. The French army in some ways was both adaptive and atrophied at the same time. It was adaptive in the sense that it adopted quite impressively modern equipment, particularly armour, and in some cases it's fighter arm as well. But its preemptive adaptation was based upon fighting the First World War plus. We know of the Maginot Line, for example, this enormous fortified line built along the shared Franco-German border. If the Maginot Line had been constructed in, say, 1914, then the invasion of France in that year would have looked very, very different. And what we see is an adaptation that's in some ways based too closely on history and doesn't have also that little bit of vision that looks towards the future. And the French army, it is beset with problems, I should add, in the 1930s, but its adaptation is to fight the First World War plus. The Maginot Line will hold the Franco-German border, and then the French will use its armoured forces and its infantry to enter Belgium, where the Germans, which is the only position the Germans can invade France to, and fight the Belgians essentially, fight the Germans in the middle of Belgium with the aid of the British and the Belgians. This is an example of preemptive adaptation in some ways. France is predicting the type of war it's going to fight, and it's predicting how it's going to go, and it's trying to set the terms for it. It's trying to limit where the Germans can go and force them to fight on French terms. In that sense, it's not necessarily a bad idea. Where that preemptive adaptation goes wrong is it does not take into account what the Germans will do. It assumes the Germans will be forced to simply rerun 1914 themselves. The French become so focused on preventing a repeat of the German invasion of 14, where the Germans took huge chunks of northern France and obviously set the tone of the war, that they fail to take into account that the Germans themselves are an adaptive force. The result of this is the French begin in 1939, and they have no real capacity to take the war to Germany or offer any immediate aid to Poland, and then they simply wait for the Germans to do what the French want them to do. The result, of course, is a cataclysm in 6 weeks. There's deeper problems, of course, in the French army. There's a certain degree of atrophy in parts as well, but I think that's an interesting example of preemptive adaptation gone wrong. They're predicting the future war, and they have their predictions wrong because they haven't thought enough about what the future will look like. They're simply thinking that effectively warfare has not changed. It will just be a repeat of the First World War, albeit with slightly different weaponry, or considerably different weaponry. That's one example of a preemptive adaptation which just simply doesn't get the trends right. I could also make the case that the British in some ways in the 1930s make some similar errors, although I think the British problem in the 1930s is atrophy rather than preemptive adaptation. But that's a very interesting question. And the more you read into history, the more you'll find examples of armies attempting to predict future trends, but perhaps becoming a little bit too locked into looking into the past, with the result that they then suffer when their opponent has adapted faster and more appropriately than they have.
Next question comes from Tony Watson at the Army Knowledge Centre. He says, we always seem to emerge victorious from our training exercises. Would incorporating defeat into exercises encourage adaptation?
Absolutely. This was a problem that the British Army had in 1902 to 1914. This is the era when the British Army first really starts to have a serious maneuver, training maneuvers, possibly in divisional strength and so on. There's a lot of problems with this, problems of location, problems of time, problems of rules, for example. But one of the problems that's it does not exist is the fact that forces can indeed be defeated. There's a number of generals who go on to command in the First World War who get rather badly handled at maneuvers. Douglas Haig is one of them, who's quite badly trounced in maneuvers by a British officer who sadly perishes at the start of the war, called James Grierson. But and I think actually incorporating defeat and setback into maneuvers is very, very valuable. And it's part of, I think, and we see this in the British Army that period, part of a culture that it's okay to make mistakes. One of the features of the British Army in that 1902-14 period is there's a real move to saying we're not moving away from criticizing people for making errors of judgment in training. Allow them to make mistakes and then allow them to learn from them. Now, that's not necessarily to say that you encourage mistakes, of course, but it's a direct reaction to the Boer War, where some officers complained that they would rather just follow orders mindlessly and result in defeat, because then they've at least followed the order and it's somebody else's fault. Encouraging or allowing mistakes in training and allowing the existence of defeat, I think, has an important effect on adaptation. It encourages you to try things even if they don't go right initially, and it's much better to make those mistakes in peacetime than it is in wartime, when real lives will be lost. But in that 1902-1914 period, there is also there's pressure on the idea that training the army to cope with defeat can encourage a defeatist spirit. And I think that as much as we might sort of roll our eyes at this, I think there is a point in that. If you're constantly telling your soldiers in training you've been defeated, then they begin to think that way, and you don't want that as you go into war. That said, some of the most interesting training exercises, the most useful for 1914, when the Germans invade France, occur in 1912 and 1913 in Britain. And in these cases, certain divisions start practicing retreats under pressure, on the assumption that a battle has been fought earlier and they then have to retreat and they will be under pursuit. Not every unit in the British Army undertakes this training, but those that do all speak highly of it when they actually are forced to do this in the opening months of August 1914, the opening part of August 1914 during the German invasion. Training in adverse circumstances, and that can include people making mistakes and being defeated, therefore has value. And the opposite, of course, can also be true. If you train and always emerge victorious in the friction of war, when things don't go according to plan, it can lead to a greater demoralization. And I think finding a way to incorporate that without inculcating the idea that we'll always be defeated is a very useful feature. The British, incidentally, in that period, try and get through this by, rather than having soldiers march around and tell them you've been defeated, they try and, in the modern term, they gamify it. Use of war games where the situation immediately goes wrong, or where it's very easy for the British officers who are playing the war game to be defeated, and then they're forced to react to that instead. And doing it in that sense, I think, does have some value.
Next question is from Chris Manning at Land Capability Analysis Branch inside of the Defence Science and Technology Group. He asks, can you expand on preemptive adaptation and how we can proactively design or develop options for changes in the future? Wargaming items from history, or modernising and extrapolating those things to the future?
Well, as a historian, it's probably natural I tend to look backwards, but I can speak from my own experience with this. At the university, one of the courses I teach is specifically designed for students. These are undergraduate students, 18 to 21-year-olds, who are members of the Army Reserve and have a hope to ultimately commission into the British Army. And a method I've found particularly, it certainly works very well with them, and I've taken it to the Royal Artillery, is wargaming and gaming, especially now we have the technology that's a bit more than just pen, paper and counters. And it's not just wargaming necessarily the big stuff. It's as entertaining and fun as it can be, and indeed educational it can be, to wargame the entire Battle of El Alamein or so forth. Finding examples throughout history of small actions and small instances, and then turning them over to the students can be valuable. And I give you an example of this that exists in print. Some of you may have heard of a quite wonderful small book called The Defence of Duffer's Drift, written by a British officer in the Edwardian period called Ernest Swinton, who later becomes famous for the co-inventor of the tank. Defence of Duffer's Drift, if you're not familiar with it, it's a novel set in the Boer War about a young lieutenant who has to defend a ford with 50 men. He has all sorts of problems, and it's written in the style of a series of dreams, or perhaps more accurately nightmares, in which he tries to defend this drift, gets absolutely duffed up, and then tries again with the lessons he's just learned. It was designed as an entertaining educational book in the mid 1900s, excuse me, the early part of the 1900s. And it's still in print to this day. And most interestingly, I think it's spawned an enormous number of imitators in the 1920s, 30s, and most recently, an American book called The Defense of Algeria effectively takes the Defense of Duffer's Drift concept, which in some ways is almost a choose your own adventure book, and it translates it to the Iraq War. And there's also a book that's only recently come out, which is about cyber warfare, and it's called something like The Defense of Battle Point Duffer, again written by Americans. And I think looking back into the past and finding small actions or small incidents that are of relevance to this day, it doesn't have to be about the technology that was used then, it's about the problem. So to take Defense of Duffer's Drift, a young lieutenant with a small force has to defend a position a long way from reinforcement. That's as universal in military history as you can think. And taking those old ideas and then putting them to current soldiers and getting them to just think about how you adapt in ways where it's not possible to simply fall back onto doctrinal manuals and so on, is a good way to start making people think about preemptive adaptation. But I would also add, and I hope I've sort of got this across in this talk, that there has to be an element of future thinking as well. And this is where people who are working with the latest technologies will have to put on their soothsayer's hat a little and try and predict how these will play. To go back to combine it to historical examples and this combination of future thinking, examples such as the defense of battle position Duffer, where you're taking a very old example, holding a small position with a handful of men, but you're putting it into the realm of cyber warfare, shows what you can do. The human problems haven't changed that much. The technology is changing. How do the two intersect, and how do we make these decisions? And again, to go back to an earlier question I was asked, when you're gamifying these things and when you're playing them as a game, this is a great opportunity to make mistakes without devastating consequences. And I think playing it through, even if it goes wrong, and then learning from what went wrong, is a very important part of this training. And I think it's one of the advantages that gaming has for us.
Next question comes from Bob Parker at Anglesea Barracks. It appears that whether the Boer War, France, or not in 1914, or in post-Saddam Iraq, the failure to adapt in war has been due to a lack of intellectual capacity to change, rather than due to physical capability. Is enough time spent in peacetime on developing the intellectual flexibility to adapt to an unexpected tactical or operational situation?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I think one of the lessons of history, certainly from the British Army, is the simple answer to that is no. Why do I say this? I think it's for two reasons. First of all, in peacetime, fighting against atrophy is very, very difficult, and the British Army throughout this period has had problems which it considers it's never fully solved, such as by being an all-volunteer army, there's a constant churn of manpower. Often units are at low strength. There's constant changes of process. And one of the features of atrophy in organizations, of course, is that bureaucracy becomes the primary target, rather than actually thinking about, well, what can I do at a future point, which may theoretically not arrive, a war. One devotes one's intellectual energy to processing bureaucracy. For example, I must finish all these emails at the end of the day. And we can mock this and we can denigrate it, but it's a feature of bureaucracy, and it's difficult to overcome. The way it is ultimately overcome is by everybody buying in. This focus on trying to generate intellectual energy is all well and good, but if you're not giving officers or indeed soldiers sufficient time to think about this, to wargame it, to play it through, you're not encouraging it, you're not rewarding it, then it simply won't happen. As much as we can sit here and say it would be wonderful if we could generate more intellectual energy. It has to be actually driven from somewhere, whether that the intellectual energy will be generated from below. But it's been shown time and time again in management theory that if intellectual energy coming from below reaches a barrier, either in the middle or the upper ranks, eventually that intellectual energy dies. How to encourage that type of energy is a question I think that the British Army's never fully solved itself. It grapples with it, and at times I think it does a lot of good things, whether it's through the promotion of, for example, there's a big move in the British Army at present to promote thinking blogs about this. I think that's a very good initiative. There's a bit more wargaming going on, but it has to come from somewhere. The tone has to be set, and this works in multiple ways. Both it has to work from the top down to the bottom. There'll always be intellectual energy. It's sort of a background hum, but how can it be harnessed and encouraged? That has to be set. Somebody has to say, this is what we want. They have to reward it and encourage it. It's not enough to simply say, we want a culture of intellectualism. Well, what are we going to do to actually reward it? And finding that in history is harder. A very first question I was asked was about the 1920s and 30s German army. Again, I don't think that that's a wonderful example to follow because of the political circumstances. But what that army does do very well is it does harness intellectual energy and encourages intellectual energy, encourages a lot of writing on this, all for internal consumption, I might add. Partially this is, I think, because it's getting away with it without political oversight and so forth. But I think it can be done, particularly with small professional armies, volunteer armies, but it has to be encouraged. There has to be a system in place for it. It's not enough to simply say, we want this, and then say, well, we want you to think about adaptation. I want you to study military history, but here's 5,000 forms that you have to fill in first. Where's the priority going to lie? And finding that balance is something that I think has eluded a lot of armies throughout history. It's amazing that, to quote from the First World War, there's quite a good memoir that was written afterwards called Memories of a Staff Officer. And he says, it's amazing how war burns bureaucracy. And I think that's an interesting point. In peacetime, it builds up and we lose the intellectual energy. In warfare, suddenly all those forms become rather less important and intellectual energy is promoted instead.
So that was our last question that we have time for. Do you have any comments you'd like to make to wrap up?
Yes, I just wanted to end with a little example about how everything old can eventually become new again. Earlier this year, I was at the Russi Land Warfare Conference. Some of you may well have been there. An excellent conference held in London. Soldiers, academics, Ministry of Defence personnel, really good intellectual energy in that room. And one of the panels was about the importance of moral factors in manoeuvre. What does that mean? It means the actual will to manoeuvre, I should say, that it's not enough to simply deluge a position with fire and then just assume everyone that you're shooting at has been killed or disabled. You're going to have to get up and move, and how do we encourage this? And it was interesting thinking, and a number of the attendees were struck by what an unusual approach this was in an era of technological warfare. And I thoroughly enjoyed the paper, excellent speaker and so forth, but remarkably, and nobody noticed this, I think, apart from myself, and this is only because I've read this period to death, the discussion of moral factors in manoeuvre could have been taken from the 1909 Chief of Imperial General Staff Conference, when that very same topic was discussed, about how to train soldiers to be willing to maneuver rather than simply fire rifles and machine guns. And it just struck me then that a conference over 100 years ago in 1909 was still debating exactly the same personnel and tactical problem that we're discussing in 2018. Now, that's a rare example, but the very fact that it exists, I hope, gives you enthusiasm and encouragement to study military history yourselves. It's a very rewarding field. If you don't already enjoy studying military history, I can assure you, all you need to do is find the war or the campaign or the commander or the personality that appeals to you, and there will be something that you can learn from it. Thank you.
Giles, on behalf of the Cove team and everyone that attended today's Cove Talk across the country, I would like to thank you for your outstanding presentation. No doubt it will generate a lot of discussion in various locations around the country after this webinar concludes. So we really appreciate your time, especially noting the differences in our time zones.
Yeah. Thank you very much.